Hi everyone, this is Jim Davis with an episode of Bridging the Gap, where we take research, pour through it, and make it digestible so that you can use it in your daily practice. Today's article is about sleep deprivation. It's called Sleep Deprivation, Impact on Cognitive Performance. It's by authors Alhola and Polo Kantola. I hope I pronounced that correctly. They're from the University of Turku out in Finland. So this is a study out in Finland, originally published by the Neuropsychiatric Disease and Treatment Journal in 2007. I'm going to bring you the three big takeaways I got from reading through this research. If you want to find this study directly, Google this. First takeaway, we have to recognize the difference between homeostatic and circadian processes when it comes to sleep regulation. Sleep is regulated by those two things, and they're unavoidable and have to be considered in concert with one another. So the homeostatic sleep driver or sleep regulator is a pretty simple drive toward balance, meaning the longer you are awake, the stronger your drive to sleep will be. That's the homeostatic balance. Fairly straightforward. You can compare it to hunger or thirst. The longer you go without, the more in need you are, the more your body's going to kick in mechanisms to push you toward the outcome that it wants. The second component, though, circadian, is a really interesting one, especially because we do so much work in schools. I'm in school right now. Circadian, essentially, one cycle around the sun, a 24-hour circadian clock is what every cell in our bodies is programmed to. The recognition that there could be differences in the turning of that circadian dial feels important. So, like, for example, students, adolescents, are actually, if you picture that 24-hour cycle, that dial, they're actually turned ahead approximately an hour. So where an adult might want to go to bed at 10, an adolescent might want to feel that sleep drive, want to go to bed around 11. And obviously wake time is shifted by an hour. Quick anecdote on that idea. We hosted a meeting one time at 7 a.m. and I cannot tell you how many adults and professionals were like, oh man, I'm so tired, 7 a.m., this is too early. Why are we scheduling meetings at 7 a.m.? And about 2 or 3 slides into the presentation that I was making, I got into that circadian talk, and essentially the big reveal was, well, however we felt as adults arriving to school at 7 a.m. due to this circadian adjustment of sleep drive, that's how our students are feeling at 8 a.m. And yet we're not talking often enough about shifting back school start time. Food for thought. Takeaway number 2, this is a big one and an important one, essential one to the article. It talks about the decline in cognitive performance and changes in moods. In this analysis, they go over memory retention, they go over long-term memory, short-term memory, they go over motivation, what's the impact of sleep on motivation. In all capacities, sleep deprivation impairs cognitive performance. Now, they do their due diligence and they cite all the studies wherein there was sort of a null result, a null impact, or something semi-counterintuitive, and they do a nice job breaking it down. But the ultimate idea is, in a state of sleep deprivation, whether it's acute, like meaning like and heavy, meaning like you don't sleep for an entire night, you're awake for 42 hours or so, or chronic sleep deprivation, those are sort of 2 categories, pulling an all-nighter or chronic sleep deprivation. In all cases, cognitive performance is impaired. On the takeaway front, like what can we take away and use in our places, that we have to recognize that. If we're trying to be high performers in our jobs, if we want students to be high performers in their classes, we have to recognize that there's no amount of willpower that can overcome the physiological degradation of sleep deprivation as it maps onto cognitive performance. Again, our question, almost always, does our behavior match our goal? As an institution, within a workforce, in the student body, that needs to be considered. Number 3, this was a big takeaway for me, and I'm not sure it was necessarily the thesis of the article, but I thought it was pretty compelling, is in standard acute sleep deprivation, meaning you pull an all-nighter or whatever it might be. In one night of 8 hours of sleep, you can recover from that, at least in these cognitive performance tests. So you pull an all-nighter, you're feeling terrible the next day, you lay down for 8 hours, get a nice sound night's rest, and cognitive performance went back up to baseline in those cases. What is more interesting to me, and what I think is probably more standard for people just going through the world, is chronic partial sleep deprivation. So not 0 hours of sleep, but you sleep 5 hours, you sleep 6.5 hours, whatever it might be. And you do that over time. Chronic partial sleep deprivation In order for participants in these studies to get back to a baseline in terms of their cognitive performance, it took 2 nights of 10 hours. So you pull an all-nighter, 8 hours of sleep usually gets you back to baseline, but if you are chronically sleep deprived, even only slightly, it takes 2 nights of heavy sleep, 10 hours, to get back to baseline. So again, this is really worth considering. More often than not, we think of, going back to that first point, our homeostatic drive, our sleep regulation system driven by homeostasis. We have been up for so long, so we must rest for so long to balance that out. I think that's where our minds are at mostly. We don't often think about the circadian sleep drive. And all 3 of those points put together would push me toward reconsidering the structure of schools, especially high schools. So I guess this is my sort of selfish takeaway from all of this. Circadian rhythms are different in adolescents, so expecting them to perform at the same level at the same times as adults goes counter to biology. We shouldn't assume that. We also in schools say that we're pushing toward high cognitive performance. Yeah, but maybe we're doing something systemically that's impeding one's ability to perform at a high level cognitively. All of that's important. And then the third, just how long it takes for one to recover. I can't help but think of the student who is sleeping until, noon on the weekends, and their parents and maybe society is calling them lazy. I can't help but think that maybe for 5 consecutive days, they're in a state of relatively chronic sleep deprivation, chronic partial sleep deprivation at least. And then on the weekends, they are doing that 10-hour push. They're trying to recover. So maybe the way it's playing out in our society is far more predictable than we'd think. Maybe adolescents aren't inherently lazy. Maybe these student athletes are being sleep deprived at a systemic level, at a systems level. And by the time they get to the weekend, they're so freaking exhausted, they can't help but sleep in late. And if you want to know more, check out the article, Sleep Deprivation, Impact on Cognitive Performance, which appeared in the Neuropsychiatric Disease and Treatment Journal in 2007. If you've got anything you'd like us to take a look at, please throw it my way. We'll break it down. We'll get our research committee on it. We'll give you 3 big takeaways from important and evolving research in the field. And if this was of any value, go to our YouTube page, like, and subscribe.